by the way, have you got insurance on your bicycle? No.
Yes.
Have you got a helmet on? No.
I don't have to wear a helmet.
No, but are you a sensible person?
Are you wearing a seatbelt?
Are you a sensible
Are you
person?
wearing a seatbelt?
No, you're not.
No, you are
No,
not.
because I've just took it off.
No, exactly, and you're on the road. So there is. I've got you for.
Oh, I don't know why I'm laughing. That becomes quite Shakespearean in its intensity the longer it goes on. And if you do watch it, there's a moment of just sheer slapstick comedy at the end. But anyway, I shouldn't laugh, really. Nick Freeman is the lawyer they call Mr. Loophole because of his uncanny knack of finding ways to defend his clients, some of them celebrities. So your view on Nick is that cyclists are their own worst enemies to a certain extent, goading motorists?
Well, I think in this particular instance, I don't think either of them come out smelling of roses. I mean, the motorist clearly needs anger management lessons. His conduct was appalling. But at the same token, the cyclist has got the evidence on his webcam. All he needs to do is contact the police. He doesn't need to stop. He doesn't need to engage with the driver, and he certainly doesn't need to post it on YouTube. And of course, what he's done, in my opinion, is he acknowledges, if you listen carefully to the conversation, is he winds the driver up, and of course, the driver takes the bait and he behaves appallingly. Well, it opens up a very interesting debate, because what we really want is we want safer roads, and we've now got a massive number of cyclists on our road. The legislation doesn't begin to deal with them. And in my view, what needs to happen now, there needs to be a sensible debate in order to ensure that the roads become safer for all people who use it. And we need to use it with this number of cyclists. There needs to be a massive government investment, and of course cyclists need to contribute to that. But we also need legislation to enable us to identify cyclists, because at the moment cyclists are anonymous. And we need to know who they are in the same way that we know who car drivers are. So if there is a discretion, it can be dealt with due process of law. We then need legislation, and we don't have sufficient legislation at the moment. The legislation is really, if you're drunken cycling, which of course is incredibly dangerous, you could be fined £1,000. Well, that's clearly completely inadequate. We need a point system. We need to consider disqualification. We need to have cyclists being forced to wear helmets in the same way that drivers are forced to put on their seatbelts. So we really need to look afresh at the whole situation of how we are going to share our road space. And we need to start from scratch, move forward positively and sensibly to ensure that it accommodates both sides. And that's really what this is about. This is an unfortunate video. It's an unpleasant video. And I'd just like to say one other thing. The chap at the end, I mean, I know it's slapstick humour, but he has a very bad fall. And it's unfortunate, isn't it, that the cyclist didn't decide to go to his assistant, but just simply legs it.
All right, I didn't.
Flat on his face. Flat on his face, which is unfortunate, I think.
Okay, well, I didn't quite get that far. I think, given what I've been before, I think he would have approached with some trepidation. But just stay with us, Nick. Just some news just in from the Press Association. A 14-year-old boy who stabbed a supply teacher in a racially motivated attack has been sentenced at Bradford Crown Court to 11 years detention. We'll hear from the court shortly. First, Carlton Reid joins us, editor of BikeBiz.com, author of Roads Were Not Built for Cars. Carlton, what Nick Freeman said, first and foremost, is why post the thing on YouTube? It's everyone loves a viral video by definition, but what was the point really? Why not just take it to the police?
Well, it did get taken to the police, and the driver was cautioned for his violent conduct. And as you said in the run-up there, if he didn't post it on YouTube, he wouldn't have that comedy gold. And just to answer Mr. Freeman's point about why didn't the cyclist go to the person's aid when he'd fallen on the ground after that wonderful swallow dive, it's because he'd been swearing at him and he'd been threatening violence to him. I think it's rather understandable that the cyclist did not go back to help him.
But again, why post the video? Why not, if you just want justice to prevail, posting the video raises the already high temperature between cyclists and motorists. So why not just, in general, why post these videos online? Just take it to the police, and if they don't act, maybe then post it online to see if you can encourage them to act.
That is a good point, and the what's happened with the huge number of videos that have now gone online is the police are now actually believing cyclists much more. Previously, they would take the word of the motorist, and I'm a motorist as well, so this is not a them or us argument here, but they would take the word of the motorist, and they wouldn't take the word of the cyclist. Now, with video evidence, there is very difficult for police not to trust this. And so just the amount of the overwhelming evidence out there now being posted, it's kind of tipping the balance now that motorists might now be considered to be, perhaps they were doing that sort of thing because we've seen all this evidence. And of course, motorists are just as able to fit dash cams. And I would love motorists to fit dash cams, because then when they unfortunately do something daft on the roads, then we can ask the police to pull their dash cam and then use it against them, and also when they're saying it was the cyclist's fault.
Also, if a cyclist does something daft in the road, like go over a red light, which cyclists routinely do, then that could also be used as evidence against cyclists. Except you can't identify the cyclists because they don't have number plates. As Nick pointed out, if you want a level playing field, everybody's got to be identifiable.
Well, you don't have number plates on bicycles because bicycles aren't 1 ton bits of tin running around the countryside in the towns, potentially hurting people. Cyclists are pretty benign. It's a very benign form of transport. I get very surprised at people on the airwaves, on the BBC, in the local newspapers, getting so hot under the collar about such a benign, simple, wonderful, quick, easy form of transport, which is very normal in other countries.
I speak as an experienced cyclist and motorist, and there's a lot of... Well, it's all horrendous. The standard of cycling is generally terrible. The standard of driving is generally terrible. The condition of roads is generally terrible. It's just sort of terrible all round, and therefore chaos prevails.
Yeah, we have got very finite amount of road space, so we have got to share it carefully. And that's what the cyclist was pointing out right at the beginning of the video. That the motorist, if you look at the beginning of the video, the motorist went very, very close to him, and that's against the highway code. Rule 163 of the highway code, which I've just filmed with Chris Boardman, it goes live later this week, shows 163 in action, which is the motorist, and that's myself when I'm driving, has got to get in the opposite carriageway when they overtake a cyclist. You must treat a cyclist the same you would treat a motor vehicle. And unfortunately, motorists don't seem to realise Rule 163 in the highway code tells them to get right the way across, give cyclists plenty of space. Yeah. So that motorist wasn't giving the cyclist plenty of space, and that's where it all escalated from. Okay. If he had have given the guy space, this would have been a non-issue.
Also, there was a key point in that particular video, and we shouldn't focus it directly, that you can't ride right next to car doors when they're parked, because just one might open and then that's you. So you've got to keep wide of it. But just going back to Nick, what would you say about what you've just heard? How would you go about identifying a bicycle? You can't be asking for registration plates, surely.
But there needs to be some form. I mean, it's interesting. I don't know whether Mr. Reid accepts that cyclists should be identifiable. You've asked him a very simple question, Adrian. He hasn't answered it, and the impression I get from what Mr. Reid says is he doesn't accept that we need to be able to identify cyclists, and I don't agree with him on that point. And he still hasn't argued your point, incidentally, about whether we need to post these sort of incidents on YouTube as opposed to handing them simply into the police to ensure that justice is done. So the 2 points that Mr. Reid hasn't answered, in my view, we must have a system, where I don't suggest necessarily a number plate system, but some form of system that we know whoever is on a cycle, we know that person. We can go into a database, as we can with DVLA, we know exactly who that person is, and that person is accountable. That must assist the safety of all road users.
What would you say? How would you react to that? I mean, just take us back, Carlton, to the question of identification. Do you accept it for the level playing field? Bikes should be identified. Obviously, they're not as dangerous as cars, although potentially that doesn't mean they're not dangerous at all. But why not identify them?
If identification were such a panacea, then motorists would not speed, they would not text at the wheel, they would not do all of these things we know they do very, very commonly. And Mr. Freeman actually gets motorists off for these driving infractions, unfortunately. So identification is a non-issue, really. And where do you then draw the line? Do we also have to identify pedestrians? Because pedestrians also use the road. When they cross the road, they are a road user. Do we start having pedestrians to wear T-shirts? Does Mr. Freeman want them to be chipped in their heads? I don't know where he wants to go with this argument, but it's pretty much a non-argument. Nowhere around the world successfully has registration plates for cyclists for very obvious common sense reasons that the Department for Transport recognises.
I mean, Nick, in Australia, somebody called Paul in Fareham tells us, and I don't know whether this is true, has the ring of truth about it, said cycling regulation is high in Australia and participation has collapsed. The safest roads are those where pedestrians, cyclists, horse riders, car drivers all share the same routes, like the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, so where cyclists don't dress like they're about to be attacked and cycling rates are very high.
Yes, there needs to be a huge investment and a complete rethink about how we share our roads. And at the moment, what's happening is the cyclists are now on our roads under old legislation, and our current old system, which is an anachronistic, doesn't deal with the current situation. For Mr. Reid to suggest it's a benign form of transport, in my view, he's not living in the real world, because if you travel on narrow, busy roads with cyclists riding two abreast in contravention of the highway code, there is nothing benign about that at all.
Adrian, can I just come in here?
Go on.
I'm
Nick.
firmly of the view that we must identify cyclists at all times to make them accountable for their transgressions, so that, like motorists, if they have caused a breach in the law, they will be dealt with. If they're acquitted, then that's somebody else who makes the decision that that breach wasn't actually incurred. But what you're saying, Mr. Reid, is that actually we shouldn't give them the full force of law. We don't even know who they are. They can cycle with impunity, and I don't accept that. I don't think it actually increases road safety from a cyclist perspective.
Quick point, rebuttal, if you like, Mr. Reid. Go on.
Mr. Freeman is a specialist in road law, one would assume from his job title. However, he doesn't seem to realise that it's perfectly legal to ride two abreast. It's not against in the highway code to ride two abreast.
It is legal. It is legal unless the roads are busy and narrow. And as you are aware, Mr. Reid, neither of those words are defined. And those are guidelines. It's not in statute. The highway code is a guideline. It's not law. And what you and I, I'm sure, will agree, we both want the roads to be safer. We need legislation, not guidelines, to deal with this very serious problem.
Okay.
So that it's
There
safer
I can certainly agree.
Right. All right. We've got some agreement, which is always a nice point to finish on. So, Nick Freeman, thanks very much indeed for that, and also Carlton Reid. A few more details from Bradford Crown Court, when in the past few minutes we heard that a 40